Hello, welcome back to the Gentleman Psychic. Hi, Mike. I see that you're already here. I am your host, your MC, your master of ceremonies. Richard-Lael is one name, not two. If I were just Richard, anyway, I am going to go ahead and go over here to my Facebook, and I've been recording both. I should do restream. I've not been doing that lately. So let's see, where are we here? We'll go. What's on your mind? We'll go live. Live video. Go live. And we'll set this one over here. Hopefully today I can get the phone to stay in one space. I don't know that I will. Let me see. Maybe if I take this over here, and maybe this can hold that one. I don't know that it's going to work, but it might be worth a shot. Maybe. Let's see. Is that going to work? I don't know. Thank you. It's called a garrison cap. It's a garrison cap it's a military hat. It's also called an envelope hat, and it has a few slang words that I won't repeat. Oh, here comes the alarm. Okay, there we go. Hello, Luther. Hello, Christy. Hello, Mecca. I am trying to set up the phone over here. I really wanted people to go over to my YouTube, but nobody goes to my YouTube to watch story time. So I wanted to change so that everyone could read it and hear it. I wanted to move. Okay, that's okay. It's better on YouTube. That's not a very flattering image of me down below, but I cannot help that. So that is just the way that it's going to be. However, my focus is going to be here on YouTube more than it is on Facebook, because YouTube is here for posterity. As it is, we have 2 viewers over on YouTube. We have 7 over on Facebook. And Monferno, hello, greetings to you. I'm doing well here in New Orleans. Thank you so much. I am absolutely loving it. I hope everybody is doing well. I hope that you are prepared with something to drink. I hope you've picked your poison. I hope you have picked your poison. I hope you have your babies, your dollies, your princesses, your dogs, your kitties, your lovers, your blanket, your fans, whatever it is that you require for good night stories. I want for you to enjoy and relax. So as you are relaxing, before we actually get too much into story time tonight, I'm going to show you something. I went into the Goodwill down the way. To find things for my bathroom, and I didn't really find what I was looking for, but it was fine because I found this. And then I broke him on the way to the car. He's a deviled egg. Here's his little tail. He's a deviled egg, but I broke his tail on the way to the car. So I'm very disappointed in myself for that, but I will glue him back. And I thought he was kind of adorable, a deviled egg. I thought it was quite apropos. Another thing that I found today, I wanted to show you this. I have a collection of taxidermy. For those of you who do not know, I have a collection of taxidermy, and I got this little picture today. So it has the family of bears, Mama Bear and Papa Bear and Baby Bear, and they're all getting ready to take their picture. Sort of. I think this. I'm not certain. The backing says it's probably turn of the century, sometime around then. Anyway, I got that again today too, just because I liked it. All right, Ben Livingwood, thank you so much. I love my hat. I love my hat too. For those of you who are joining, it is called a garrison. It's a military cap, and I enjoy it. Thanks for adding me. You're very welcome. I appreciate it. All right, my lovelies. Now, ladies and gentlemen, boils and ghouls, guys and gals, and non-binary pals, without further ado, my lovelies, without further ado, I think we should begin story time. Now, those of you who are on Facebook, you have a very strange view of me. I would really, really, really rather you go over to my YouTube, but that is fine. You are here, and it is not a flattering image of me, but that is okay. You are going to have to deal with it. Maybe I'll have to deal with it. Anyway, all right. Where did we leave off? There's nothing like beer when you knock off from a day's work. Matt Duncan popped the top off and handed a foaming bottle to Lieutenant Marshall. Don't you ever want a glass? Concha suggested. If I can't have a stein, said Marshall, right straight from the bottle is next to best. And besides, why make more dishes for you to wash? Thank you, kind sir. Aren't you having any? I don't like beer, and I'm not going to be one of those girls who go around pretending they do. Matt exhaled loudly after a mighty draft. Hits the spot, that does. Now, what are you on the trail of, Terence? Lieutenant Marshall looked mournful. Curse of profession. Nobody ever suspects you of just a friendly call in passing. This is non-professional? Well, it is not, said Concha. I can see that gleam in your eye. I'll bet I'll bet it's still that floater with the rosary you were with Sister Ursula. You were asking Sister Ursula about. What's that? Matt asked idly. Nothing important. Fellow named Tarbell got bumped off down on Main Street, but that isn't what I. Matt wrinkled his brow. Tarbell? I met a Tarbell somewhere recently. It's not a common name. Jonathan Tarbell. Marshall leaned forward. So maybe this is a professional call after all. Where? When? Damn, I can't remember. It was just casual. I know. It was Austin Carter's. You remember? Concha put in. The man I was telling you about with the Manana Literary Society. Marshall nodded. Friend of Carter's, then? This is Tarbell? No, I think he'd come with somebody. Who? I can't remember. Nobody I know well. Runcible, maybe, or Chantrell. So, Marshall nodded slowly to himself. Matt, I'm going to ask you for a favor, and I'm not going to explain any of my reasons. You'll have to take me up on trust. Okay, Matt conceded. Tentatively granted. What goes? I want you to take me to one of out to Carter's for the next meeting of the Manana Literary Society. Don't introduce me as lieutenant. I'll be just another tomorrower. I ask you no questions and you'll tell me no lies. Is that it? That's about the size of it. Well, for the one thing, Terence, you've got a wrong idea about the MLS. It isn't a matter of regular meetings. It's just when some of the boys happen to get together, usually at Carter's. And for another, I don't know, as I like furnishing the sheep's clothing for a wolf like you in our quiet flock. Marshall set down his beer. Matt, if I talked, I could make you see how important this might be. There's a damned good chance it could solve one murder and forestall another. And if you insist, I'll talk, but I don't want to, not yet. Matt started to speak, then sat glaring into his beer. Friendship's one thing, he said at last, and police duty's another. I don't know as I'm willing to. It was just then that Concha returned. The phone's for you, Lieutenant, and it's Sister Ursula of all the people. Oh, and look, while I think of it, we're going out to Carter's tonight. He always likes to meet people. Why don't you and Leona come along? You'll like fantasy writers. They're nuts. Matt shrugged resignedly. You can't win. Marshall was smiling to himself as he answered the phone. Yes, sister? Leona told me you weren't home yet, so I thought I'd try here. It might be important. Yes? That rosary. You know, Sister Perpetua says it's a very famous piece of carving which was thought to be lost. She says it was done by Domenico Saltimbunco, which is apparently a most eminent name, the way he pronounces it, and was carved to order for the first Mrs. Fowler folks. Marshall expressed himself and then hastily apologized. Don't apologize, Lieutenant. It is surprising, isn't it? When we were speaking of Hilary Folks only this afternoon, but this isn't Hilary's mother. I think he was born of the second marriage. The first Mrs. Folks was the most prominent laywoman, you know. I don't know how I can thank you, sister. If you really wanted to thank me, no, I won't even ask it. I do try to be good, you know. Goodbye, Lieutenant. The sign said, Danger. Nitrosyncretic laboratory. Keep out. Marshall paused and stared. So, he observed, and what the hell is nitrosyncretic laboratory? Matt Duncan smiled. Nice gag, isn't it? You see, the way this house is situated on a hill, people come to this door before the proper main door. This is Austin's workroom, and he used to have a hell of a time with salesmen. Pounding to the door are distracting, like when you're working on a collapse of an interstellar empire. But since you put up that sign, salesmen take one look, shudder, and then get the hell out. Leona laughed. I'll have to try something like that for when we have children, for when the children take naps. The children, Concha repeated. It must be nice to say that so casually. Do I really sound so casual? I know I try to, but I still go sort of warm all over. Marshall coughed. The children are home and asleep, and there's a competent girl in charge of them. For the moment, they're hers, and we're just people. Come on, darling. Let's see the science fiction menagerie. Bernice Carter met them at the proper door. Austin's holding forth, she said softly. Well, we'll postpone introductions till he's done. These people, Matt told her, are Marshall. They just want to listen. They're Marshals. They just want to listen. They'll have the chance, said Bernice. The menagerie was meager this evening. In the large living room were only 5 men. The tall, thin one established in the heavy chair under the reading lamp, Marshall rightly took for his host. Of the others, one was somewhat plump and somewhat short, rather like a poor man's edition of Hilary, without that almost unconscious assumption of self-importance, which only being born an heir to the folk's fortune could give. One was stocky individual with goatee and no moustache, and serious air. One was open-faced youth who might well be a college sophomore, and the fourth was a small, sharp-faced man whose little eyes conveyed an odd mixture of boredom and complete absorption. And that, Austin Carter was saying, is just the trouble with this stuff. It's too damned galactic science fiction can be interesting only so long as you preserve the human frame of reference. Of course, the reader should think, golly, this is wonderful, spaceships and blasters and stuff, but he should also think, after all, maybe that's just the way I'd feel if I rode on a spaceship. If your concepts become too grandiose, you've left the reader 1,000 parsecs behind. Still, the sharp-faced man protested, his stuff sells, and his fans yowl for more. I'm laying a bet they won't much longer. You can distend a reader's mind with new concepts only so far. Eventually, he says, phooey, and goes back to the more homely commonplace of Joe here, or me, who modestly considered the destruction of solar system, or maybe just a planet as colossal enough without annihilating galaxies left and right. The sophomore opened his mouth, considered, and said hesitantly, Stapleton. Olaf Stapleton's a special case. For one thing, he's a great writer, which most of us haven't much hope of being. For another, he's not hitting the magazine market, but most of all, he's got the amazing faculty of leading you on so gradually that you're willing to accept his vasty concepts as familiar. And that, said the goatee, is one of the greatest services that science fiction can render to science, in which respect Stapleton is surely the most notable talented to enter the field since Fowler Folks. Austin Carter frowned at the name of the master. The sharp-faced man snorted. Bernice took advantage of the silence to become hostess. These people seem to be listening raptly, but they might as well know who they're listening to, or whom, just in case they're that kind of people. Matt, I think you know everybody, and probably you do. Concha and these, Matt informs me, are marshals. My husband, Austin Carter, Mr. Runcible. The plumpish one, Mr. Finn, the sharp-faced one, Mr. Chantrell, the goatee, and Joe Henderson. Marshall and Leona duly gave and received greetings. They're novices, Matt explained. Don't expect them to show due reverence for the great name, and I don't mean you, Austin. So, Marshall glanced inquiringly at the poor man's Hillary. Runcible, if not a great name, was at least a delightfully freakish one. Runcible shook his head and waved an indefinite gesture of disclaimer. Austin Carter laughed. No, Runcible, so far is just a name signed letters to the editor. Though you might mark it down for future reference, some first-rate men have come up from the fan of ranks, but the name that struck Matt dumb with awe when he first heard it was Joe Henderson. The sophomore shuffled and hung his head. I write a little, by which, Bernice Carter translated, he means that he's the oldest name in science fiction that's still big time. When he can find time between hacking out young upstarts like Austin and me right in our place, he's been leading the way for 15 years and still looks 19. And if only I had a goose handy, I could offer a very pretty demonstration of Joe not saying boo to it. Joe Henderson's grin spread over his face as slowly as that of the Cheshire cat, and far more warmly. Get along with you, Bernie, he drawled. Carter slapped him on the back. The modesty of true genius, he announced, which makes me just as glad that I've never laid claim to either quality. What I was saying to Joe when you folks came in, one more minute of being a hostess, Bernice interrupted. Then you can go on. She collected wraps, took orders for drinks, and vanished. Anybody else coming? Matt asked. I'd like these poor innocents to see the MLS in full swing. Anson McDonald and Lyle Monroe may be around, and possibly Tony Boucher. Tell me, Matt, what do you think of that last opus of Tony's? Nuts, he wrote. He wrote it with his eyes shut and one hand tied behind him. Same old stuff. Mutiny on the spaceship, the uncharted asteroid loaded with uranium ore, and Martians trying to steal it on a time warp. Hell, it's routine. Marshall blinked. It's a little hard for an innocent, as Matt rightly calls me, to take all that in one gulp. I can't quite think of spaceships and uranium and Martians as being drably commonplace. You get to think that way, said Austin Carter. Supposing in real life you broke down a locked door and found a corpse bleeding from 20 wounds with no possible weapon anyplace. You would maybe think it was a trifle peculiar, but the mystery fan would say, Leona, being a mystery fan, picked up her cue. Just another locked room. Exactly. So to us, just another spaceship or just another time warp or. And what, Marshall asked, is a time warp? Mostly, Carter confessed, a handy device. The term refers to, of course, to the theory of the curvature of space-time continuum. A warp in that framework could produce most curious results, possibly send you off not on ordinary time travel, but completely out of this continuum. I like ordinary time travel, said Leona. So prosaic. You can have fun with a time warp, Joe Henderson contributed. Concha laughed. The first time I came across one was in the story of yours, Joe. There was a reference to a character in an earlier episode who had gone off on a time warp and never been seen again. I thought it was a new kind of binge. Time warps, Carter went on, are handy. They're part of the patter, like subspace, which don't ask me to explain. They let you do the damnedest things and make them sound scientific, as indeed they quite possibly are. Ask Chantrell here. He's from Caltech. To my mind, Mr. Marshall, the goatee observed somewhat ponderously, the free imagination of the writers is of more scientific value to the progress of mankind than 90% of these writers, of these theses written for the doctorate. And this imagination is absolutely free. You must get away with murder. Carter shook his head. Not any longer, or at least not in the better markets. Good science fiction requires more self-consistency, more plausibility than any conceivable realism. Your world of the future can't exist in any high fantastic vacuum. It's got to be real and detailed and inhabited by real people. With all due apologies to Captain Comet, Joe, the days of pure gadget story and the interplanetary horse opera are over. Marshall gratefully accepted beer from his hostess. I'm not sure I follow those terms. Carter looked about the group. With two new victims, I'm afraid I'm about to repeat my famous lecture on science fiction. Runcible won't mind because there's nothing a fan loves like listening, and Finn here is always hopeful I may say something worth stealing. To the others, I apologize, but here goes. Science fiction is essentially a magazine field. Outside of Fowler Folks and H.G. Wells, practically no contemporary imaginative writer has been commercially successful in book form. So its development has to be studied in the mags. And these, way back in early days, were possibly, to the non-fan outsider, not so good. They had to be sure scope and imagination and originality and a vigor that few other pulps could equal, and neither quality had ever been markedly prized in the slick field. But they also had a sort of cold inhumanity. The science was the thing that the hell with the people involved. On one hand, you had what I call interplanetary horse operas, which were sometimes pretty weak even on their science. These were pure westerns translated into cosmic terms. Instead of fighting off bands of hostile redskins, you fought off bands of hostile Martians, and as you pulled out your trusty blaster, they regularly bit the stardust. The gadget stories were more interesting. They frequently made honest attempts at forecasting scientific developments, atomic power, stratosphere exploration, the rocket's blight, that so absorbs Chantrelle all the features that may revolutionize the second half of this century as thoroughly as radio and aeroplane have transformed this half. All these become familiar, workable things. But the writers stopped there. Interest lay in the gadget itself, and science fiction was headed for a blind alley until the realization came that even science fiction must remain fiction, and fiction is basically about people, not subatomic blasters nor time warps. So there's a new school now, and I suppose Dawn Stewart, the editor of Surprising, is as responsible as anybody. Dawn's idea was this, and it was revolutionary. Grant your gadgets and start your story from there. In other words, assume certain advances in civilization, then work out convincingly just how those would affect the lives of ordinary individuals like you and me. For instance, in one story of René Lafayette's, there is a noble amount of whiskey drinking, and the name of the whiskey is Old Space Ranger. And that one phrase paints an entire picture of a civilization in which interplanetary travel is the merest commonplace. No amount of gadgetry description could make the fact of spaceships so simply convincing. In other words, to sum it up in a phrase of Dawn, Dawn's, I want a story that would be published in a magazine of the 25th century. After this lecture, the conversation grew general. Matt and the Carters talked shop. The thin-faced Finn interjected an occasional word of wry commercialism, and Mr. Chantrelle spoke of the coming test run of his latest rocket car. Marshall sat back and drank his beer. It was indeed a strange new world, and a fascinating one, but he could not give it his whole attention. The policeman's mind kept reverting to duty, and in the midst of the phrase about klystrons and space orbits and the positronic brain tracks of Asimov's robots, he tried to sum up these people in connection with the attempts on Hilary Folk's life. They didn't fit, not at all well. Despite the high-flown fantasy of their conversation, they were as quietly ordinary people as he had ever encountered. Or were they? Were not their very ordinary traits the possible marks of a murderer? Motives he could not know yet, but it seemed not too unlikely that anyone in this field might at some time have had a run-in with Hilary Folks. And granting motive, how would these individuals react? Bernice Carter was coolly efficient as a hostess and as a conversationalist. Might that efficiency extend to the calm performer of a necessary elimination? Austin Carter was, in far more intelligent way, as self-sufficient and self-important as Hilary. Might two such dominances conflict fatally? Finn, apparently an agent specializing in this field of fiction, was shrewd and acquisitive. Might he not find personal gain a sufficient motive for any action? Joe Henderson was inarticulate and repressed. Might repressions gathered too long burst forth lethally? Chantrelle. But this was random guesswork, unworthy of detective, lieutenant, even when off duty. Marshall waited for the next passing of an angel and said, I met somebody the other day, might interest people in your field, Hilary Folks, the great Fowler's son. Oh, said Austin Carter. Hilary. His voice was absolutely expressionless. You know him? I know his brother-in-law, D. Vance Wimpole. There, sir, is one of the damnedest and most fabulous figures the whole pulp field, and he tackles most of it. Fair on science fiction and excellent on fantasy, but what I mean by fabulous. One night in New York, John Stewart and I were seeing him off to Chicago. He got to talking out loud, a fantasy short, and an ad lib from a book to tag. John liked it, but said, "The trouble is, now you'll never write it. You never do write what you have talked out first." And Vance said, "Oh, won't I?" He left by train for Chicago around 8. The next morning, the story was on Don's desk. Airmail special delivery from China. Oh, from Chicago. I won't say it was a masterpiece, but it was plausible as it stood and drew good fan mail. Joe Henderson nodded. That's Vance for you. Where is he now? Bernice asked. I had a letter from him yesterday, Chantrell said, postmarked from Victoria. He's on his way back from Alaska and should be here in a week or so. I'm postponing the test run until he arrives. Sure of that? Sure of that? The agent demanded. I thought, yes, nothing. I'd like to meet his prodigy, said Marshall. But about... Oh, Carter picked up his story. Vance is something. He uses an especially geared electric typewriter because he composes faster than any ordinary machine can go. He works only 6 months out of the year and spends the other 6 hunting, anything from polar bears to blondes. Marshall reluctantly listened to all the unbelievable saga of D. Vance Wimple. The subject of Hillary had been deftly killed, but not before he had caught the sharp glitter in the little eyes of Finn and the expression of relief on the face of Bernice Carter as her husband maneuvered away. Around 11, Leona interrupted a fascinating discussion on whether you could construct a robot where a werewolf to say, "This is fun, but we've got a girl staying with the children, and she has to go home sometime." The Carter's sorrow sounded most sincere. "You too, Matt?" Austin added. "Afraid so. I want to get home, get some work done in the morning." "Just a minute, then. I want to show you those pictures of the denvention I keep forgetting." As Carter went downstairs to the nitrosyncretic laboratory, Marshall asked, "I'm still innocent. What's a denvention?" Bernice explained. "The science fiction fans are highly organized, and they have annual world conventions. The last one was in Denver, so the fans, ever incorrigible neologists, called it the Denvention. The next one's here in Los Angeles, and I'm afraid it's going to be called Pacificon." There followed 10 minutes of looking at pictures of people of whom Marshall knew nothing. Carter, he gathered, was an enthusiastic camera fiend with every known photographic gadget and even an adjunct to the nitro lab in which he did his own developing and printing. The pictures were good, particularly the nude which had wandered in by mistake. It reminded him of Leona in her unreformed days. He said as much, and the men thereafter accorded her a certain respect which they had not displayed to the mother of 2 wonderful children. "And what," he asked at last, "is this weird display?" "That? They had a costume party on that last night. Come as your favorite SF character. Bernie wanted to go as Dale Arden, but I'm afraid it was an over-ambitious project. And who's this lad with the beard and the stick?" "That's Austin," said Bernice. "I took this picture." "So, and what did you finally go as?" "The Wicked Queen of Ixon in Joe's comic Legion stories. It was fun." "It was fun," Leona echoed as they went down the stairs. "I think I'll lay off mysteries for a while and try this strange stuff. It sounds appetizing. How about you?" After a silence, she repeated, "How about you?" Sorry, dear," Lieutenant Marshall was wondering. if he should tell Hilary Folks how shrewd a guess he had suddenly made to the identity of his so far fumbling murderer. The third day, Saturday, 1st of November. The photograph and the knowledge that one of the individuals depicted had himself developed the picture. Had himself developed the picture. It was little enough to go on, Marshall reflected as he sat at his desk and went over the latest routine reports on Jonathan Tarbell, which told him precisely nothing. And what tied the two cases together? A phone number and a rosary. Any of his colleagues would hoot at him, or at best smile derisively, but Marshall could not help believing that the two cases were one, and that his prime duty as the moment was not so much to crack the murder of the floater, Tarbell, as to prevent the murder of Hilary Folks. Let him get himself murdered, Leona had protested sleepily after they were in bed last night. Then it'll be a big case and there'll be headlines about heir to Folks' fortune, and you can solve it and be famous. And who cares if Hilary lives or dies? Then Marshall had tried to explain the basic sanctity and importance of human life, any life, which was a curious concept to expound in the 1940s, and the significance of the preventive over the punitive in the policeman's duties, until Leona said that having debated at Oxford was swell, only at this hour it might wake the children. So he slept. But in his dreams he kept pursuing and trying to frustrate to a barrel-chested, black-bearded man who was seeking a garret with a rosary, that oddly named fan who resembled Hilary. There was something about a rocket, too, and an old volume of Who's What, though he couldn't remember in the morning where they fitted in. A complete record of this dream would have been the greatest interest to Austin Carter or Hugo Chantrell, both of whom were disciples of J.W. Doone. The dream reminded him. He set aside the Tarbell reports, took up the phone, dialed an inter-office number, and gave instructions for a thorough canvassing of all theatrical costumers to trace the rental of a large black spade beard of the Derringer model. Probably unnecessary, but worth a try. He hesitated, phone in hand. Then he nodded resolutely to himself, got an outside line, and dialed Hilary Folks' unlisted number. Veronica Folks, hello, was rich with indefinite emotional overtones. Marshall could imagine her investing a grocery order. If she ever stooped to be so plebeian of a task, with that quality of a Borgia laying in the month's supply of aqua tofana. May I speak to Mr. Folks? Who is this, please? The fiend with the pipe, said Marshall perversely, and wondered if she would hang up. She didn't. In a moment, Hilary's smooth, deep voice was asking, Yes, yes. Marshall speaking, Mr. Folks. Oh, hold on a minute. I'll take this on the other extension in my study. Hold on. Marshall held on and wondered why Hilary always repeated everything. It was like a stammer or a tic, and probably a psychoanalyst could have fun with that. Yes, Hilary resumed after a few seconds. Didn't want to disturb my wife, Lieutenant. She's been terribly nervous since that bomb episode. Terribly. And what did you find out about that? What sort of bomb was it, Detective? A very common type. No creative imagination. Anyone with underworld connections could pick up one easily. Underworld connections? But, Lieutenant, you can't mean I'm being threatened by a gang. Now, don't jump to conclusions, Mr. Fawkes. The damnedest people can have some underworld connections, especially with the political setup in this town. I'll lay odds that even a stranger in town like you, if he had a machine, if he had as much money as you have, could get a hold of such a machine after a little nosing about and palm greasing. Or our only hope of tracing it is through a stool, and that's not too likely. Oh, said Hilary sadly. But why I called? Have you thought of any more, shall I say, candidates? No, Lieutenant. Heavens, no. Excepting that, as I said, yes, the various people you may have offended as executor of the estate. So tell me, have you ever offended one Austin Carter? Carter. Let me see. Oh, yes, that was the man who wanted to quote all sorts of things from my father's works and wouldn't pay for them. I was firm about it, so then he cut out the quotations rather than pay me anything. Was that all? Yes, Lieutenant, yes. Excepting, well, Hilary chuckled. I confess I have played some small part in causing Metropolis Pictures to decide against Mr. Carter's last novel. I naturally felt a man who has displayed such shocking irreverence toward my father hardly belonged in the same studio that has done such fine work in producing Dr. Derringer films. Naturally. Yeah, naturally, Marshall echoed, admiring the ingenious ingenuity with which Hilary presented his case. But, Lieutenant. Yes. Do you mean to imply that you have any evidence against this Mr. Carter? Marshall hesitated. Will you be home this afternoon? Why, yes. Good. I'll be out to see you. I want to ask you a few more questions and give you some idea of what evidence I have. Then we can see if you wish to prefer charges. My, Hilary gasped. This is such prompt work, Lieutenant. So very prompt. I never expected. There was a long silence. Marshall said, Yes? Twice. There was no answer. He said, Mr. Fawkes, loudly, and he heard a groan and a sort of thudding crash, and there was only silence on the line. He jiggled the phone cradle fruitlessly and hung up, and dialed again. He got a busy signal. The Fawkes receiver was still off. Marshall got an inter-office number, gave certain instructions, hung up, and reached for his hat. Then, on an afterthought, he dialed the number found on Jonathan Tarbell. There was no excitement at the front of the apartment hotel. No crowds, no patrol car. Stable doors, maybe, Marshall said to Sergeant Ragland. But you stay here in front of the entrance. There shouldn't be much mid-morning traffic. Get the names of everybody that comes out and his reason for being here. The first stop was the manager's apartment. Her greeting was reserved. Yes, I do go up to the Fawkes, but Mrs. Fawkes herself answered the door and assured me that her husband was working in his study as usual. I couldn't very well force my way in, could I? And since you didn't choose to tell me what was the matter. All right, Marshall said. Thanks. I hope you realize, she went on, that this apartment house is not accustomed to having the police. Sorry, but we go where we're needed. Thank you. He rode up in the elevator, half relieved. If Veronica Fawkes in the same apartment was not aware that anything was wrong, he paused in his thoughts, unless, of course, Mrs. Fawkes herself. The maid Alice answered the bell at the Folks apartment. I'd like to speak to Mr. Folks. He's in his study, sir, and I'm afraid he won't want to be disturbed. It's most important. Yes, I remember, sir. You're the police. But even for the police, I don't like to interrupt Mr. Folks. He's very particular, sir. What is it, Alice? Oh, what is it, Alice? Veronica Folks, in her negligee, too impressively sumptuous to be seductive, came up behind the maid. Her eyes gleamed as she saw the visitor. You again. Sorry, Mrs. Folks, but it's highly important that I speak with your husband at once. She seemed to repress the whole anthology of remarks. You were talking to him on the phone not half an hour ago. Have you seen him since then? No, he's still in his study. Then I'm afraid I must ask you to let me in. Or, Marshall added as he hesitated, or I must use official permission. Veronica made a gesture of resignation. Very well, come in. She crossed the living room and knocked on the door of the study. She repeated the knock twice, then opened the door. As Marshall followed her into the living room, a gentle voice said, Good morning, Lieutenant. Marshall looked about and stared. He was so amazed to behold Sister Ursula in this apartment that he had still found no words of greeting when Veronica Folks' sharp scream shrilled through the room. He's dead! Veronica gasped. There seemed to be a terror and a genuine sorrow in her voice. She stood rooted in the doorway, unable to make her body follow her gaze to what lay on the floor. Marshall pushed past her and bent over Hilary Folks. There was almost no blood, but only the ornate metal handle of the weapon was visible between the plumpy, fleshed shoulder blades. The knife itself was buried. The telephone lay sprawled on the floor, as inert and voiceless as its owner. You, went on Veronica intently. Until I met you, nothing ever happened. Life was all right then. And what do? First you insult me, then you beat poor Hilary into unconsciousness, then you attack me, and now... Marshall rose. Some of the tension had faded from his face. I'm sorry to be anticlimactic, Mrs. Folks, but your husband is still alive, and medical aid is more important right now than disputing your version of facts. He went past her again into the living room and turned to Sister Ursula. Sister Felicitas, he noticed, was there too, and as usual, asleep. Sister, he said sincerely, I don't know how in the name of your own favorite saint you got here, but I've never been gladder to see anyone. I'm going to ask you to be useful. If I were a sheriff, I'd swear you in as a deputy. Watch these women and don't let anyone for any reason enter that study till the doctor comes. Sister Ursula nodded and said, Certainly. The maid goggled, and the cousin with whom Marshall had met before hesitated in the hall doorway, looking questioningly at Veronica. My husband's dying, Mrs. Folks exclaimed, and you forbid me to. I'm afraid I do. I'd like to see you stop me, she said, as she started toward Hilary's body. Marshall's hand clamped down on her wrist, and a quick jerk brought her across the room and deposited her on the sofa beside the nuns. And stay there, he said tersely. Marshall used the manager's phone downstairs. To use the Folks phone would mean replacing the fallen apparatus, and he wanted an exact photograph of that, while the dowager-like manager dithered about, murmuring prayers that the name of the house could be kept out of the papers. He requested an ambulance, a doctor, a fingerprint man, and a photographer, and thanked his stars for the foresight which had made sure, before he left headquarters, that such request could be instantly filled. Sergeant Ragland stood in the lobby, still guarding the door. There wasn't anybody tried to get out, he said. Sorry, Rags. Come on upstairs. Maybe something for you there. DOA, Lieutenant? Ragland brightened. No, not quite. Keep your fingers crossed. The lieutenant stationed his disappointment sergeant at the door leading into the study and confronted the assembled witnesses, 5 of them, and all women. He groaned a little, but the thought of the austere Sister Ursula on the scene of the crime consoled him. All right, he began. At 10:35, I telephoned Mr. Fawkes. You, Mrs. Fawkes, answered the call and brought him this phone. He wanted to talk privately and went off to the extension phone in the study. I take it you shut the door after him. Veronica nodded. All right, go on from there. And the manager rang the bell and wanted to see my husband. Heaven knows why. I told her he was working. My doing, I'm afraid. I thought that if anything had happened, she might be needed help. If anything had happened, she might get needed help to him before I could get there. And then, said Veronica Fawkes with deadly restraint, you came. But that's half an hour later, and what happened from then on, I know myself. What I want to find out now is the in-between. Sister Ursula spoke up. But Mrs. Fawkes is quite correct. So far as we in this room knew, nothing happened. That is, nothing concerning Mr. Fawkes between the time he took your call and your own arrival here. You were here all that time, sister? Here in this room with Mrs. Fawkes and Sister Felicitas. He turned to the maid. And where were you? In the kitchen baking. That's why I didn't answer the phone when you called. I'd just finished my work when you rang the doorbell, sir. And you, Miss Green, said the cousin. And may I hope you forget other things as easily as my name? Marshall blushed and felt Sister Ursula's curious eyes upon him. You did send for a doctor, the girl went on eagerly. Of course, Miss Green, and there's nothing we can do for your cousin meanwhile. Any amateur attempts to shift him or to remove the knife might be exceedingly dangerous. But her voice shook a little. I don't think there's any danger, and the best way you can help him is by helping me to prevent another such attack. His voice was surprisingly gentle. It was pleasantly unusual to find somebody who seemed really to give a damn about Hillary. So if you'll tell me where you were from 10:35 until my arrival here. In my room, typing some letters that Cousin Hillary had dictated. So, Marshall frowned, I'm not very certain of the ground plan of this apartment. I know, the girl smiled, and Marshall reddened again. But it's simple enough, at least as far as you're concerned now. East of the living room, on that side, there's only Hillary's study and a bath opening off of it. To the west, there's the rest of the apartment, 2 bedrooms, and the kitchen, and the dinette, and the maid's room. Marshall digested the description. So then anyone, say either of you, any of you or Alice, coming from the rest of the apartment to the study, would have to come through this room. Yes, or of course, we could go out into the hall and go around. The study has its own separative entrance. Marshall nodded. All right, now, sister, what time did you get here? A little after 10, Lieutenant. And you were here in this room when Mr. Fawkes took my call? Yes, he was in the dinette finishing breakfast. He came in here. I must say he looked rather surprised to see Sister Felicitas and me, and went on into the study. And you stayed here all the rest of the time until you arrived. And if I may anticipate your next question, no one went through this door to the study after Mr. Fawkes. Neither in nor out? Neither. And Mrs. Fawkes was with you all that time. This is too much, Veronica exploded. Not only must you ask my guests and my dependents of all questions that you should rightfully ask me, but now you go so far as to imply. Please, Mrs. Fawkes, Sister Ursula interposed gently. The lieutenant has only been performing his routine duties. I hope, she added with what might from anyone else almost have been a wink. I thank you, sister. And Mrs. Folks was with you? Yes. Did you hear any noise from the study? I confess that I didn't. Did you, Mrs. Folks? No, Veronica was careful to speak to the nun rather than to the officer. But then she and I were deeply engrossed in conversation, and Sister Felicitas, as you know, is rather deaf. I think it would have had to be a serious struggle to make itself heard. So, then it's clear that Mr. Folk's assailant came in through the hall door to the study and struck him down silently without any scuffle. All right. I think that's all I need to ask you at the moment. Please remain here, however, until after I've talked with the doctor, who should be here in a minute. He rose, made a slight bow, and went into the study. Hilary sprawled there undignifiedly in his shirt sleeves. Today's shirt was a delicate mauve. The splendid red and gold dressing gown was draped over a chair across the room. He was still unconscious. A good thing that movement before the arrival of the doctor and the ambulance would simply entail needless pain and danger. Marshall contemplated the hilt and its angle and calculated that the worst damage possible would be slight, he hoped. He fumbled in his pocket, drew out a piece of chalk, bent down and outlined the position of the body, worrying a little about the effect of chalk marks on a Persian rug. Leona, he was sure, would raise hell. Lieutenant, he started up. Sister, how did you get in here? Ragland? The sergeant looked abashed. She come in right after you, Lieutenant. I thought she was with you. All right. Well, sister, since you're here. Sister Ursula stood by the hall door. Look at this. Marshall looked. Not only was the button pressed, which indicated that the door was locked, you could easily enough lock it behind you that way, but the night chain was on. He said nothing. Holding the knob gently in his handkerchief, he turned it to release the lock and opened the door with the chain on it. It opened about an inch, not conceivably far enough for the hand to reach in and hocus it. Obstinate annoyance settled on his face. Somebody's put a latch on afterwards. Who? When? Remember, Lieutenant, that no one but Mr. Folks went into this room before your arrival. After that, Mrs. Folks went only as far as the threshold, and she tried to go further. You jerked her back. While you were gone, I obeyed your instructions and saw that no one came in here since then. Sergeant Ragland has been at the door. Please don't let my presence restrain you, Lieutenant. Express yourself as freely as you please, but I'm afraid you're confronted again with what Leona calls a locked room problem. The doctor rose from his examination. Nasty, he observed, but I'll pull him through, all right. Okay, boys, he gestured to the ambulance attendants with a stretcher. Can't you wait till the photographer gets here? Marshall protested. Sorry, my boy. He was younger than Marshall, but the phrase seemed part of his professional equipment. Which would you sooner do, photograph a corpse or interview a healthy victim? Get along with it there. Hold on, we'll need his prints. At least if we're to learn anything from this room, if this desk yields a stamping pad, it did. And Marshall busied himself with Hilary's limp hands. When can I talk to him? He asked as he worked. Do I know? This afternoon, possibly. Come around late and see me. May have to put him under opiates, though. Near thing. That. From where it went, you'd expect to have struck the heart, but the blow was directed toward the right. Odd. Marshall set aside the printed paper. You can load him now. You'll be careful of the hilt when you remove the knife. Prince, I know my business, my boy, and if the murderer knew if the murderer knew his, it won't matter anyway. See you tonight. Just a minute, Sister Ursula interposed. Yes, sister? Could that wound possibly have been self-inflicted? The doctor gave a superior snort. Look. He grappled the lieutenant, whirled him around, and jabbed the long finger at a point between the spine and the left clavicle. Try stabbing yourself there. Just try it. I'm afraid my habit is rather hampering, Sister Ursula tried. But it does seem as though if I had no sleeves, I might be able to reach it. Reach there, certainly, the doctor demonstrated. Strain on the shoulder muscles, but you can reach it. Possibly even strike, but you reach it from below. So even if you struck it with enough force to penetrate, which I doubt the blow would be directed upward, this wound points down. You couldn't reach there the other way. Oh, you couldn't reach there the other way, Marshall asked. From above? Physically impossible, the doctor snapped dogmatically. The stretcher-bearers had passed into the next room. Veronica Fawkes was making inarticulate little moans as her unconscious husband passed by. Then he positively was attacked, said Marshall. Oh, then he was positively attacked, said Marshall. 1 second. We only have a couple of pages on this one, and then we'll stop. The stretcher bearers had passed into the next room. Oh, wait, let's see. So then he was positively attacked, said Marshall. The doctor snorted again and stalked out wordlessly in a sort of Groucho Marx crouch. So, Marshall whistled. Thanks for specifying that point, sister. I'd taken it for granted, always a bad thing to do, but now we know for certain. And where does it get us? He walked over and opened the door of the bathroom. There was one small window. A midget conceivably might have been able to squeeze through it, but even a midget must have disarranged the neat row of shaving things arranged on its sill. They did not include, Marshall noticed, the talc with Hilary St. J. Fawkes had nationally endorsed. He pushed the shower curtains all the way back. The stall was empty. He returned to the study. One of the large windows was open. Both had screens which were hooked on the inside and unlatched on the screen and leaned out. The wall here was absolutely blank save for windows. No cornices, nothing but window sills, a good 15 feet away in any direction. 3 stories below was bare cement area. He turned around. The problem, he stated, isn't getting in. There's nothing to show that the assailant mightn't have been waiting in here, possibly hidden in the bathroom when Hilary came to answer my call. But as for getting out, I can give you 3 possible descriptions, sister, of this would-be murderer. Yes, Lieutenant. All right. A, he is invisible man in person and walked right past you out there. B, he has suction pads on his feet like a gecko and hung on the wall out there while he worked some sort of string trick on the screens, then clambered to the ground or to the roof, still by suction. Letter C, he has pseudopodical finger that he inserted through the 1-inch crack in the door to maneuver the chain into the locking position. There you are. Take your pick. I take the first one best, said Sister Ursula seriously. The invisible man. And why? Remember, Lieutenant, that it is the title not only of a novel by Wells, but also a short story by Cheston. As a Catholic, I naturally prefer the latter. Lieutenant Marshall shrugged resignedly, but before he could pursue this cryptic hint, the photographer and the fingerprints expert had arrived. The next 20 minutes were crowded. When the experts were through, Marshall's patience was near an end, and he knew no more than he had to start with. The prints in the room were almost exclusively Hillary's, or the maid's, with here and there a random and plausible specimen of Miss Green's or of Mrs. Fowlkes, and securing the specimen prints of the latter had been one of the major nightmares in his expert's life. The hall door had only Hillary's fingerprints on both inner and outer knobs, and no trace of gloved smudges. The telephone also only had his. Marshall himself lay in the chalked outline for a photograph of the crime. That is, he lay in the well as his 6 feet 2 could fit into the outline of Hilary Fowlkes' 5 feet 9. Then he experimented with falls from various positions and concluded that Hilary must, as had indeed seemed obvious all along, must have been struck down while he was seated at the desk, telephoning Sister Ursula. Checked that in the next room, with voices talking, the sounds even of Marshall's heavier body were audible but not strikingly noticeable. You heard them only if you were listening for them. At last, the lieutenant again confronted the women in the living room. "I've done all I can do here," he said, "and there's nothing further. I only need to ask you until I've talked with Mr. Fowlkes. You will be doing the police a favor if you don't pester the hospital with attempts to see him until I notify you that he's recovering. That he's receiving. In the meantime, you can all be trying to remember any events of this morning or earlier that might throw light on the matter, and especially any individuals you think likely to have made such an attempt. Of course, Mr. Fowlkes may, and we trust he will be able to tell his assailant's identity without further ado. But we must be ready in case he can't. Sister, may I drive you home?" "Certainly, Lieutenant." "And you have room for Sister Felicitas too?" He had forgotten about the other nun completely. One always does. And that's where we end for the night. And I'm glad that there was someone who stayed watching on the Facebook. We have people who stayed watching on the YouTube. Anyway, lovelies, thank you for joining me on Storytime tonight. It's kind of getting good. I've read this book before. We're halfway there. For my Facebook family, I will be doing. I don't know what schedule it's going to be, but I'm going to be reading the Halloween Tree on Facebook. I'm not going to read it on YouTube. Copyright infringements and whatnot. I'm not even supposed to really read it on Facebook. But it's sort of is a traditional classic, and so that's what I'm going to be doing. Anyway, lovelies, thank you for being with me. I hope you have a beautiful evening. Much love to you, and I will see you next time. Take care.